It's now my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this afternoon's plenary. Don Lenihan is Vice President, Engagement at the Public Policy Forum in Ottawa. He is an internationally recognized expert on democracy, public engagement, accountability, and service delivery. This work spans continents and includes recently co-authoring a paper called Co-Design, a New Service Vision for the Government of Australia. This paper develops a community approach to service delivery and is based on Don's approach to public engagement. The paper appeared in the January 2011 issue of the Public Administration Today and was a catalyst for the Government of Australia developing a pilot project involving all three orders of government to test the model. Don has served as an advisor to the Government of New Brunswick on public engagement and was president and CEO of the Crossing Boundaries National Council, and most recently is the author of the book Rescuing Policy, The Case for Public Engagement. This book was published this past January, and Don has brought copies as gifts for us today. You'll find it on your table. With that, we welcome Don Lenihan.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. And let me start by saying, first of all, just thanking the organizers from OMSA and all of you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon and to talk to you. I think I've got about 40 minutes to present some ideas to you and then about another 10 for questions. So I will stick rigorously to the timelines, I promise, or I may get hooked off stage. First of all, I think it was already mentioned that I've brought copies of my book for you. If you manage to make it through the next 50 minutes, you get to take the book with you. If you leave before that, you have to leave it behind. Or you probably will want to leave it behind, I'm not sure. First of all, let me just say a word or two. Can everybody hear me fine? A word or two about what I want to talk about. I am here to talk about public engagement, and I'm going to do another seminar or workshop after this, and I will talk about public engagement, but I want to come at it in a really big picture way and in some ways take you on a bit of a journey, the journey of my life. Lucky you, eh? This is what I've sort of gone through in the last 25 years. I've been struggling with integrated services or aligned services and how we get there literally for at least 25 years. It's been a passion of mine. It's always interested me. It's always challenged me. And in the end, I'm going to tell you the answer is public engagement. So I came to public engagement out of an interest and a passion for services. And there's two questions I want to talk to you about today that take us back a few steps and let us try and get the big picture. First of all, why is public engagement important today? Why are we having this discussion at all? Believe me, as a guy who's in favor of this stuff, I've been out there talking about collaboration for a very long time, and it took me a long time to get a group this large to listen. Now it's not hard at all. People are really interested in it. Why? What's changed, and why are we having this conversation now? And I think something really has changed. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit at the end, and this gets us more into the practical side, about how do public engagement processes differ from the way governments normally do business. And I will take that further out when we go into the workshop, but I certainly will say a few things about what it really is that we mean by public engagement and how it answers some of the bigger questions I want to raise. So as I said, let me take you on a bit of a journey here. In fact, let me take you way back. This is a true story. It may be embellished, but I won't tell you which parts are embellished. But it does have the virtue of being true. About 25 years ago, I went to interview the Deputy Minister of Health in the federal government in Ottawa. It was a big day for me. I got to go see the deputy, and that's cool. So I went in there and marched in, and I was asking him a bunch of questions, and I had prepared my big question for the deputy. So I got about halfway through, and I said to the deputy, "So tell me, deputy, what do you do here in the Department of Health?" He didn't miss a beat, and he answered, "We cure illness and we heal injury." I thought, wow, good answer. I guess that's why you're the deputy. I want to say truthfully, this is not embellishment. I have gone back to that moment in my life, in my career, over and over and over again. In some ways, it defined my career. Why? Because now let's flash forward to today. And if I went back into the deputy's office, who this time would be a she, as it turns out, or for that matter to the deputy's office here in Ontario, in the Ministry of Health, or in one of the municipal governments, and I asked that question again, what do you do in this department? I would get a different answer. I might still get, we cure illness and heal injury, but something would be different. This time, somebody would almost certainly add, or they wouldn't be the deputy for very long, and we prevent this stuff from happening, and even more ambitiously, we promote wellness or well-being or something like that. Somewhere between the time I actually had that first conversation with the deputy and today, we fundamentally changed what we think is the mission of the Department of Health, or Departments of Health. Not just here in Canada, not just at all three levels of government, all around the bloody world, everywhere, even in countries that are not democratic. What happened? What happened? And we're going to see, of course, it's not just health, but let me stick there for the moment. When we said that out loud, when somebody, let's pretend the minister, walked in one day and said to the deputy, I got this great idea. We're now going to go into promoting wellness. Imagine if you suddenly had to go as a deputy and figure out what does that mean for what we do here in the Department of Health. And you sit down after the minister leaves and say, what do we spend our money on? Well, we now have this thing, and you've probably all heard of it, called the conditions of, what's the conditions of health I was going to say? Conditions of wellness. And that ultimately what we've realized is a concept like wellness is fundamentally different from a concept like curing illness and healing injury. Curing illness and healing injury is a relatively well-defined idea, largely based on science, that says here's a standard and here's some things you got to do. And if somebody is sick or has broken bones, you fix them, and we have some idea what it means to get to the end of that. It's a relatively objective standard and concept of what we're trying to do in health. Wellness is not like that at all. Wellness is a balancing concept. It's a concept where if you sit down and sort of say, what does it mean to be well, you're going to find out that it means you look at a whole bunch of different factors, the conditions, as we like to say, of wellness, and that all of those things have to come into some nice, neat balance in order to be well. Not only that, it turns out that balance is different in each community, in each country, in each person. Wellness is an amorphous balancing concept that reaches out over that whole expanse of a bunch of different things that not only include broken bones and illness, it includes things like ultimately education. If you're not well educated, you're not likely to be well. It includes your environment, it includes stress levels, it actually includes income. If you don't have the right amount of income, you're not likely to be well. It includes gender, it includes culture. It just expands out over the whole policy space. When we said out loud we are in the business of promoting wellness, we changed forever how we will think about policy, and there ain't no going back, folks. And we've been struggling with that moment ever since. Whoever got up and said it, if there was such a moment, fundamentally changed the way we think about policy. Because all of a sudden it exploded our world, and we realized that if we're going to promote this thing called wellness, we're now spilling out over all these things, and every time we think about what we've got to do, we're going to have to figure out what are the priorities. If I want to promote wellness, am I concerned with environment, education, and so on, and so on, and so on. It became, as I like to say, our policy world suddenly became incredibly complex and interdependent. We realized that all these things were beginning to interconnect in ways we hadn't really dealt with before. I'm not saying we never thought about it. I'm just saying that when we talked about this before holistically a bit, we never really dealt with it that way as governments. We tended to have, as we like to say, silos. And if you think about the concept of healing injury and curing illness, it's a very limited, siloed concept that worked pretty well for a long time. So what happened when we suddenly moved into the complex world? It not only changed forever what we did, how we thought about policy. This has happened right across the board. And in the time that I've been going through and watching this change unfold, we have literally invented a whole new set of policy concepts that have replaced the old policy vocabulary. I've already told you about one of them. If you look at the heart of what we talk about in the field of health, wellness is now at the center of it. Nobody who thinks about health policy thinks about health policy without talking about wellness. But the same is true in virtually every policy field out there. We have reinvented the center and created, in my career, I've seen this happen, a whole new set of concepts. Anybody know what the change was in the environment? What's the concept that sits at the center of it now and is the equivalent in the environment of wellness and health? Anybody? Sustainable development. How many people remember the Brundtland Commission? Anybody here old enough like me? Okay. The Brundtland Commission was a commission, a UN commission, about 25 years ago on the environment, and the word sustainable development had been out there, but all of a sudden they came along and wrote this thing and said, ultimately, if you want to think about environmental policy in a complex way or a sophisticated way, you've got to think about sustainable development. And I'm not going to repeat everything I just said about health. What I want you to see is that all of a sudden in the environment, sustainable development took over the way we think about policy and started driving it in a much more holistic way. We've done the same thing in education. We moved to the concept of lifelong learning. When I was going to school in grades 1, 2, and 3, we didn't have the concept of lifelong learning. Education was a stage you went through in your life, and you finished it, and then went out, once you had your training, you went out into the workforce and worked. So here's what's happened in the last 25 years, and I have seen this happen. Some of the people in this room are old enough to have seen it too. We literally have invented a whole new set of policy concepts. I like to call them societal goals, and in every key area, there's at least one big one that now defines how we think about policy. Sustainable development, collective security in the area of security, wellness in the area of health, lifelong learning in the area of education, and so on throughout almost every policy field. Before I tell you what's happened with all this, I just want to show you how much of an impact it's had on the nature of our governments. It has fundamentally changed the way we are planning and in some senses the way we are organized. Let me show you. This is taken from the Treasury Board, the Federal Treasury Board website. And ultimately, if you, I don't know if you can see it up there, if you look at this list, these are the 16 whole-of-government goals that the federal government is now committed to. So I'm going to flip it back and forth between two slides, but let me just show you. If you looked at the federal government, or for that matter, the government of Ontario, or I think any municipal government in this province or across the country, you'd find out governments are now organized this way. Is at the top level, at the top of the pyramid, they have some big whole-of-government outcomes that we are aiming at. And if you look at what those are, we'll go back in a second, you're going to find out that a whole bunch of these are the sort of societal goals that I talked about. They're now embedded at the highest level of our government. And if you move down, the way we've started thinking about planning now is that if you go down from the government-wide goals to the department goals, when people do strategic planning, are supposed to focus up to those government goals. They're supposed to help achieve those goals, right? If you don't know how to do that, you don't know how to do strategic planning, and you'll never be a deputy. Department-wide goals down to section-wide goals. It cascades down again. Within there, the ADMs go out and do their strategic planning with their directors and others, and their goals and their strategic plans are supposed to look up to the departmental goals and ultimately to essentially to contribute to that achievement, and cascading back down if you go the other direction. And finally, right down to the level of actual programs and services, each of which, and this was not always the case, has a specific goal or objective, or maybe a number of them, which are supposed to contribute to the section-wide goals. So the motor is at the very bottom, which is the programs and services that we deliver, and they're supposed to drive, ultimately, the achievements of government, and they all move backwards up through this listing thing to the government objectives, the government-wide objectives. Everybody with me? We didn't do this 15 years ago. 15 years ago, this is not the way we planned anywhere in this country. The first government in Canada to do this was the government of Alberta 15 years ago. Now, every government in this country does it. Every government around the world just about does this. We fundamentally reinvented how we've organized and planned and talk and think about governments. Let me just go back to the other slide for a second again. It's amazing when you think how far we've come on this for planning purposes. If you just look at a few of these things, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but let me just say a number of these are conspicuous examples. Sorry, let me just get my notes here because I can't see from there. Conspicuous examples of what I call societal goals. So if you look under the first one under economic affairs and you see words like income, sorry, I can't read from here either. It's too blurry. What is it? Income, So yeah, income security, down a little farther, knowledge-based economy, healthy environment, over to social affairs, healthy Canadians, go down to the second one, social inclusion, international affairs, just below global poverty reduction, sustainable development. I would argue if you actually started scratching the surface on this, almost all of these things are tied to these holistic concepts. That's the way we think and plan. Let me sum this up by saying it's not just you, the people in this room, it is the politicians, it is us as public servants, it is the people. People out there want governments to achieve sustainable development, they want to be healthy Canadians, they want essentially lifelong learning. We've sold ourselves on these concepts, absolutely, we're committed to them, we believe in them, we want them. But there's a problem. And here's what we've really begun to figure out in the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, and that's why I think so many people now sit in these rooms, is we just have to think about this for a moment. We've all gone through this massive reorganization of our planning approaches. We all talk this way, we are organized this way, we report this way. But if you think about any of those goals that I'm talking about, here's the difference between what happened when I went back to the deputy and said, what do you do? And he said, we cure illness and heal injury. It was possible in that well-defined world to imagine in the silo that you could achieve your goal or promote your mission largely downward through the programs and services at the bottom of that cluster, whereas now the goals we are committed to are, surprise, surprise, bigger than government. Not all of the resources and authorities inside government will ever give you healthy Canadians. You know what? If you want healthy Canadians, they got to get on their bicycles. As I like to say, governments can build you bicycle paths, but they can't make you get on your bicycle. Sustainable development, lifelong learning. These are participatory concepts which involve not only governments, governments absolutely have a role, but they will never be achieved without the participation of other governments, NGOs, private sector, communities, ordinary citizens. So here's the interesting place where we are, folks. We have all over the world, even non-democratic countries, reinvented our planning process, created a whole new language, sold it to the public. Our politicians are out there preaching it rightly. We all like it. But in fact, all the resources and authorities in government could not achieve this. We've created a world where we now have one of two choices. Either we got to figure out how you're supposed to achieve those buggers up there, or we're going to have to back off and change our whole concept of the goals we're actually pursuing, because government won't get us there. Everybody with me? This is a huge tension, and I think we're all of a sudden beginning to say, holy cripes. That's why so many politicians are getting scared. They can't deliver on the promises that they're making, and so we're constantly finding ways to reinvent and explain why we can't achieve the things in the language that people now want. They want lifelong learning, they want sustainable development, they want healthy lifestyles and healthy Canadians, they want collective security, and everybody wants to promise it, but we don't know how to deliver it. Why? Because it's bigger than the resources and authority within the boundaries of government. So let me just tell you where that leads, if you haven't already guessed. One of two choices, and I think we're going to see this over the next 5 or 10 years, folks. There's no guarantee which way we go. I'm here to tell you we're at a fork in the road. Either we're going to go one way or we're going to go the other. We're going to back off this stuff and say we got it bloody wrong, and there are people who do want to do that now. Or we're going to have to figure out how do we actually change the way government works. What would it mean? Is there a way to change the way government works so that we actually can achieve the goals that we are setting for ourselves? I want to say this one last time in a slightly different form, just for impact. Effectiveness is your ability to use your resources and your authorities to achieve a goal, right? Everybody agree? That's how it's defined classically, and I support that definition. By that definition, none of our governments are effective any longer because they cannot achieve their goals with their resources and their authorities, which means either they have to change the goals, learning process, make adjustments, or change the way you actually do business. You'll be pleased to know I'm in favor of changing the way we do business. I hope you'll be pleased. I think there is an answer to this question. I think it's actually a pretty simple answer. In effect, here's where we are now. If we want to achieve those goals, what we genuinely have to do is we can't do it in a top-down, we all know this top-down language, we can't do it in the classical hierarchical stuff, and I don't want anybody to hear me saying that I'm against hierarchy or top-down. We'll always have hierarchy, we will. My point is we can't do it just with, because that's all inside the box. Collaboration is, it is the way that we work with others when we don't control them and we need to achieve something together. Why governments have to collaborate right now, why we are intuitively so responsive to that concept in language, is because we realize more and more and more that the things we're trying to achieve as government we can only achieve if others with other resources and authorities align with us and marshal their resources in ways, and us with them, that we work together on our common goals. Because it turns out they're committed to a lot of these goals too. It's not just governments who want healthy communities. It's communities and citizens and NGOs and even business groups. The real question is, how do we, or can we, find ways to work together that ultimately allow governments to change the way they do business and others, and allow us to work together and concentrate on common goals. And if we cannot do that, we're going to have to give up on the goals, at least as far as government is concerned. So what does it mean to collaborate? I just want to say a few things about this in the 10 minutes or so remaining. Is that what I have, 10 minutes more, I think? Let me just say this, is that when governments connect with the public, when they engage the public, and I'd like to say that word for a different thing, but let me use it for now and just say this, here's the way they normally do it. And we all know this process, you've all probably used it. It's what I call consultation. When governments need to involve the public in the public policy process, what they tend to do is, if we imagine the public policy process as having three very basic stages, a consultation process, it looks like this. The first thing we do is we go out in a room like this, we rent a room, we invite the public in, I'm government, I sit at the head table, I put some speakers out there, it looks a lot like this, right? And I pose a question to you. I say, folks out there, public people, citizens, we have a problem as government, here's what we want to do, what do you think we should do? And consultation is when you come up to the microphones and you tell us what you think we, government, should do. And we take lots of notes if we're doing our job well. We listen to you. You guys get at different microphones and you argue with each other about what the best option is. You compete with each other for influence over me. I listen. May the best man or woman win. And at the end of this consultation, or this period of the view stage, when all of you have had your chance to speak at the microphones, what do I do as government? I get up and I tell you, thank you very much. You can go home now. Your job is done, citizens, or business community, or stakeholders, or whoever you are. You've given us your views, so I want to send you home now. And when I send you home, then I retire into an antechamber somewhere, and ultimately I take all those views and I do the deliberation and weighing of evidence and trade-offs and compromises. I consolidate what I've heard into a single view, and I develop an action plan around it. Let's call it recommendations for what government should do. I write it up a report and I give it back to government. How many of you have seen this process in action? Has anybody not seen this process in action? Okay, here's the thing I want to say about this. I won't say a lot here. There's a lot more to say, and I will in the upcoming workshop. This is an absolutely fine process for certain kinds of problems. It's not a good process for what I call a complex problem. That is to say, whoops, an area where you need others to solve the problem. So let me stay at the general level of something like healthy Canadians. If you want healthy Canadians, and you try to engage Canadians with a process like this, you send them home before they actually ever really get to the conclusion. Their job is simply to give you information and ideas and views about what they think you should do, because that's what you're asking them. And not only that, once you send them home and you do the deliberation and write a report with recommendations about government policy and give that back to the minister, and the minister stands up and says, now the ball is in government's court, what the minister is saying back to the public is it's government's responsibility to solve this problem. That's what the whole process said. We've sent people home a long time ago. They have no ownership of the process. They have no real investment in it beyond the views that they've given, and they're waiting for government to give us the solution. But go back to what I said about the problem we're now facing. The problem we're facing is that government cannot achieve the goals it sets on its own. Yet the process that we have for engaging the public, whom we now need to solve this problem, actually reinforces the view that the problem belongs to government. In fact, all it does is make things worse, because now people want a solution to a complex issue, and we're using a process that essentially throws the public expectations back on government and leaves the minister holding a report saying now the ball is in government's court. So my basic message is this. My basic message is that if you agree with me what I've said about where we are in terms of the goals that we're now committed to and the policy world we live in, and if you agree with me that we'd like to go forward rather than retreating on those concepts, you're free to do that, then what I want to tell you is we have to engage the public, and this process is not the way to do it. It actually has the reverse effect. If you go out and try and engage the public with this process on these issues, you will make it worse, not better, because the process says to them it's government's responsibility. The process divests them of ownership and responsibility for action. Here's what I would argue, and we'll argue in our workshop. The way that you ultimately solve this is a longer discussion, let me just put it out there, is that the public has to travel through that whole process. And the public can be stakeholders, by the way. It can be stakeholders, it can be citizens, it can be communities, it could be all three. But they have to travel through that whole process together with government so that the deliberation about what it is we want to do together with our views and ultimately the plan of action about how we solve this problem is not just a discussion with government, it's a discussion with all of us because we're all implicated in what we need to do to solve the problem and achieve the objective and ultimately what the plan will be. Collaboration is not just having a shared interest, it's using the right process to get to a shared plan where we are all owners of the responsibility to deliver the solution. And if we don't get there, we can't solve the problem we've created. I want to say this again before I stop here once more for effect because I think this is a really straightforward but very powerful point, or maybe say 3 points. First of all, where we are, folks, in terms of our evolution of government, is we are now locked into a system that is by definition faulty. It's faulty because we cannot achieve the goals that we are committed to. Once we're there, the only way out of that box is either to go backwards, give up on the goals, and that's a big retreat from where we've been talking for the last 20 years, or it's to create a new way of working together. And if we're going to go that way, this process, which is the standard way that we engage people, actually works against us, not for us. We need a process that genuinely shares responsibility and ownership of the solutions and ultimately the action at the end of the day so people not only help achieve or decide what the actions need to be, they own some of the problem at the end of the day and are prepared and willing and able to deliver on some of that. How that happens is a longer thing. I just want to make that point for you. And I guess I want to make one last point, and just with respect to the community side of this before I stop, is to say this. I do want to make a pitch here, not just because most of you are municipal folks, but I do have a very strong commitment myself. I believe these public engagement processes that take the public through this whole dialogue, stakeholders and citizens, can be performed at any level of government, but my own view is if we're going to move forward on this stuff, a lot of this has to happen at the community level for a very simple reasons. Is first of all, if you want to engage people and get them to take a sense of ownership and participate, they will be a lot more likely to get involved where things are close to them, the people that they know, the neighborhoods they know, they care about that. And they will make decisions. I've experimented with this. They will make commitments at that level. They're less inclined to make the more you move up the food chain to higher levels. And secondly, I think that that they identify with their communities in a way that they don't identify with the other levels. And last of all, I just say this, is it's much easier for people to see immediate results at a community level when they're making decisions together and working together than when they're talking about something as abstract as the environment. I'm not saying we shouldn't have community processes or public engagement processes at that level, but I do think there's a special role here that's opening up for communities, and that if we go down this road, we will need to work with the public way more at that level than we have in the past, and that in some ways, communities become, I would say, the gateway to the public for provincial and federal governments. So I'd be happy to take some questions there, folks. I'd like to stop, and I'm wide open to rejection or criticism or even humiliation. Wouldn't be the first time.
Hi, Don. I'm Doug from County of Lambton. And your last slide sort of touched on what I was thinking about, but I wanted to ask you, what criteria would you recommend using to decide when a public engagement strategy should be used?
Thanks very much. Actually, I think this is a quite simple criterion, really. And I guess for those, again, who are in the workshop, I'll go into this in more detail. But there's a very simple way of testing whether or not you need what I call a public engagement process, one that moves through all three stages and requires joint action. Is you stand back and ask yourself, and we have a pretty good idea of this, at the end of the day, when I'm about to launch this process I'm planning, and we get to the recommendations for action stage, is this something government is going to be able to deliver on its own? And if you go back to my example about the healthcare system, where you talked about healing injury and curing illness, it was reasonable to imagine governments could fund that thing the way we conceived of it, and they could train doctors and build hospitals and do that mostly through their own resources and through the public service at their disposal by reaching out. But now that we're talking about bigger concepts with more diverse kinds of actions and implications, a lot of this stuff can't be done by governments alone. It may require a change in behavior on the part of people. They have to get on their bicycles to be healthy. So the real test is this. If you're looking at the end of the process and you say, the solutions we're going to find here cannot be delivered by government alone, and that's my fundamental point, you are not going to get there through consultation. You will need public engagement. And a lot of our problems are now of that sort. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Brian Marks from the Cochrane DSAB. I'm also on the OMSA Education Committee, and one of the initiatives that we're trying to get our head around is the use of social media in leveraging that technology for service delivery purposes. I'm also in housing, and we are currently, well, pretty much everybody here who is in housing is engaged in a planning process to develop a 10-year affordable housing and homelessness plan. Curious to know if we let the genie out of the bottle by using social media to engage the public in this process, what are we in for, and what's the role in social media, and how do we manage the information that potentially could come in very quickly in ways that we're not used to dealing with it?
Well, it's a really big question, so let me just take a stab at one really basic part of it. I spent a lot of time, probably about 10 years ago, when social media was first beginning to sort of emerge, or at least a lot of that would have been email and stuff at the time, but we were beginning to think about this stuff and have lots of debates, and this was pre-Twitter and even pre-Facebook. But I remember at that time, and I was one of the people at the time, I get to say, running around saying things like, the technology, this new technology is inherently democratizing, and it's going to open things up. I genuinely believed that. I no longer believe that, folks. I think that's a serious mistake. I think you really have to draw a distinction, and that's what drove me, by the way, to this kind of thinking, is you got to draw a distinction between the processes that underlie your tools and the tools. I have a friend who keeps trying to tell me, wiki, oh, that's a wiki problem. There is no such thing as a wiki problem. A wiki is a tool that may be used to implement a process that will solve this problem, but it could equally be used to implement some other process which may actually frustrate that process. And I guess the point I really want to make is this, is I'm a big fan of social media. I think that the kind of processes I'm talking about, it's an enormously powerful tool that can give us a much greater reach, can bring people in, used well. But I think what we really have to understand is we have to understand the kind of processes that we need to actually generate collaboration, dialogue, and action, and that has nothing to do with the tool. And then we have to figure out how we use those tools to reach out further. So I guess my sort of short piece of advice is all I would say here is, if you think just about the tool and you think the tool is a solution or a strategy, it's not. It will lead you in a whole bunch of unexpected ways if you don't already have an idea what the process is and how you're going to use that tool to achieve the process. So my emphasis would be on the process first and the tool second. And social media is fundamentally a tool, not a process. I hope that's an answer. Anybody else? Let me do a straw poll with you folks out here. How many of you, first of all, how many of you find what I've said about the sort of point we're at now where we're actually in this dilemma where we are now planning as governments all over the country and all around the world in a way that actually doesn't match our resources and authorities? How many of you find that convincing? Show of hands. Anybody not? Get a gold star. How many of you think that we are coming to a point where we sort of got to choose? Either we backtrack on the goals or we find a new way of doing business. Show of hands? Come on, let's have fun. How many think there's another answer? Let's hear it, please. Ha, have to speak up, won't speak. Okay? Anybody want to speak to that? I'd be delighted to hear some feedback on that. I think I'm giving you a big message here, and you're free to take a poke at me. I'm telling you, we're at a big fork in the road, you know? You can go home and say, Lenihan said we're at a fork in the road. Are we really? I think we are. What happens if we don't go down this road? What happens if we can't go down this road? Anyway, anybody want questions, comments? Yes.
This is election day in the States, as we know, and whether or not 50% of the people will even show up to vote is one of the questions. And the slide talks about motivation to participate. How do we try to get people to participate? Because I'm not sure that they are motivated. Fewer people vote at the municipal level than at the provincial or federal level. So despite the fact that municipal governments are closest to the people, there isn't a lot of participation.
I know, it's really interesting. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, and I'll just make a few sort of quick one-liners and maybe provoke you more than answer the question. First of all, let me say the thing about municipals being, the participation rate being low there. That's always been an interesting mystery to me, and here's my speculation on that, is we promoted national governments in the 19th century. They were a sense of identity. People sort of identified with them. We got in the habit of voting that way. We organized our political parties that way, and municipalities were an afterthought. What we do find about people is while it's true that they still participate more in upper-level elections than lower ones, they seem to be more concerned about issues at their local level. They get angry about their dogs, right? Or their garbage or things like that in a way that lots of times they don't about the bigger issues. Not to say they don't care about, for example, climate change. Frankly, they just don't know what to think about except it's bad, I don't want it. They absolutely know what to think about blue boxes and dog collars or off-leash dog parks and things like that. So I think people actually, they intuitively identify very strongly with their communities, but probably for political and cultural reasons, we've kind of moved ourselves in a different direction. That may change. The other thing I was going to say is back just to general participation. My own view on this is that there's lots of evidence that people are not, in fact, they're not disengaged in themselves. People remain interested in important issues, if not public policy issues, things that matter in their community and in their lives, they care about, and they're absolutely willing to do stuff about this. My view on the reason that people don't show up for public engagement or consultation processes is because they don't want to waste their time. I'm like that. I'm in this business, and I'm not making this up. I got a notice from my municipal government, I won't say where I live, a couple of months ago that invited me in my community to go out and have a discussion on some issue locally, and I looked and I thought, said to myself, literally, I'm going to walk my dog. I'm not going to that meeting. And I don't want to knock anybody here. I hope nobody's angry at me. I care a lot about this stuff. My view is just that a whole bunch of people feel like when they go to these processes, the processes are conducted in ways that they really don't make any difference at the end of the day. And if we want them engaged, we got to create a process that genuinely rewards them for showing up. And I believe that if you do that, and I've got evidence of this, they actually will start to get really engaged. One last example here, go back to the election tonight. How many people remember 4 years ago when Obama won? And he turned out all those young people online, right? And they made huge contributions. They got online. They showed up and voted. I don't know if they're going to show up tonight. But if you go back and look at what happened online in that last election, it was really interesting. I think, frankly, they got ahead of themselves, the Obama team. But if you look at the stuff they were doing, they were reaching out at the community level and they were promising people they were going to engage them in a new way. They were going to do things at a community level and they were going to use the internet to do this. They did use it to mobilize people to get votes. They did use it to mobilize people to get money. But after the election was over, a whole bunch of people found out that this online tool that was supposed to change their world and change the way the U.S. was governed turned out not to be quite so much. And indeed, things kind of went back to the same old way. And a lot of those people now are saying, what happened? And I'm not blaming Obama. I wouldn't have known what to do 4 years ago either. We're still learning about this stuff, back to the social media thing. We don't have a process to use the tools effectively. So we make big promises, and then people come online and say, wow, they're going to change things, only to find out nothing really changes except they got my money and got me to vote. Any other comments, questions, disagreements? If not, folks, I hope I haven't offended anybody out there and said I'm a big fan of municipalities, in case somebody thinks I've offended them. I truly am. I believe the future lies. In fact, let me say this as a closing note. I used this little slogan of mine a few minutes ago, that I personally believe there is an opportunity for you guys in local government unlike any opportunity in history, and it's because if we are going to do public engagement, if not, we're going to go the other way, but if we're going down this path, we are going to need your level of government. Provinces and federal governments will need you guys to reach down to that level, and not just with citizens, with stakeholders as well, to mobilize effectively at a community level. And that means you become an intermediary or are positioned to be one in a way that gives you leverage with other levels of government that you have never had before. And I believe they're going to recognize that they need you to do that, and if you're well positioned, it puts you in a very strong bargaining position in a way that you never have been before. You don't have to be the poor cousin of provincial and federal governments, and I believe that too. With that said, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope that that was of some value to you.
Okay, thank you, Don, for your insights. Some pretty powerful messages I think we just heard. Either we change our goals or we change the way we do our business, which is, I think, really good food for thought at this point in time as we're going through 10-year planning for housing and homelessness, CHIPPE planning, children's services planning, Best Start planning, you name it. So couldn't be received at a better point in time. In lieu of gifts for our speakers, we'll be giving a donation to the Daily Food Bank's People's Blueprint Project on your behalf. Thank you once again.